we can live our fullest, most just life when we live our life in connection to the truth. And we live in a society right now that doesn't tell the truth about the human person. Not in the womb, not at the end of life, and not for women throughout their lives. The only way towards justice is by telling the truth.
And on the line, I have Leah Libresco Sargeant, author of The Dignity of Dependence, a Feminist Manifesto. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you, if you're listening, to go ahead and you can go to pointofview.net. You can click on the links for today's show and get yourself a copy of this. Leah, I have to tell a little anecdote. Whenever I've been following you on Twitter, I guess X, for a while and try to keep up with your writings. So when I saw that you were going to be writing this book, I was so excited and I pre-ordered a copy as soon as I was able to. And then I guess I forgot that I pre-ordered it, and I was still so excited, and I would see you post about this book, and I pre-ordered it again because on release day, I got an Amazon package with 2 copies of the book. So I was so excited for it. I pre-ordered it twice, and now having read it, it did live up to the hype. But anyways, thanks so much for joining us on Point of View today.
My pleasure.
So let me introduce you a little bit. Leah is the author of Dignity of Dependence, which we're discussing today, as well as Arriving at Amen and Building the Benedict Option. She works on family policy in Washington, D.C. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and elsewhere, and she runs the Substack Other Feminisms, a Substack community focused on advocating for women in a world that makes an idol of autonomy. And that's really the theme here. And one of the things you write in your book is that no society can be built on a false anthropology. But we're kind of living in a world that has been built on a false anthropology, aren't we?
That's exactly right. When we start our account of the human person as though what it means to be a human person is to be a lone individual, someone who at their most human, most successful, doesn't depend on others and doesn't have their own life disrupted by other people's needs. We're describing a kind of person who, never exists in total, and really any of us can only inhabit that ideal for short periods of our lives.
Yes. And really, and this is hard for us, and I know it's hard for me too, and I've kind of accepted this more and, growing in my faith as a Christian, but we, especially in America, we really like independence. We like to pull ourselves up by our bootstraps. But really, when we pretend that that is who we are as people, or people who that's the status quo and what should be considered normal, certain people in society tend to suffer more from that assumption.
That's right. You can think about this false ideal as something that people have varying degrees of difficulty pretending to be. So no one is a lone individual. No one is entirely independent. But you can ask, well, how long is it till I get caught? And all of us are caught at the beginning. Babies are very demonstrably not independent, but we kind of allow it as a rounding error. So you grow up out of childhood, and then how long is it as an adult before you're caught being someone who secretly needs other people? For women, pregnancy means you're likely to be caught out earlier. For men, you can kind of skate along for a while, inhabiting this image of an untouchable, buffered self. But eventually you're going to get caught, and the more time you spend pretending, the harder the drop is going to be.
Yes. And that's something that, there's so many anecdotes and statistics with, people really feeling ashamed of having to ask for help or admitting that they do need others. But before we kind of delve into some of those, I think when people hear the word feminist or feminism, they're thinking of what is probably the more pervasive version of that in our society, which is that basically saying men and women are interchangeable. And this is something, that women in the past maybe had to prove that they deserved to have certain roles. And so they just wanted to prove that they could do it just as well as a man could. But there's actually something anti-woman if we continue to argue that we're just interchangeable. So what do we lose as a society when we erase those differences?
Yeah, I think a lot of strains of feminism have kind of clung to that idea of how do we prove to people that women are equal in dignity to men? And the most neutral way it feels like you can prove that is to show you can swap one for the other and it makes no difference.
Mm.
And there's cases where that's absolutely true, where the person who's cooking a meal can cook either way, but then there's little moments where that breaks down, even in moments that we don't think of as morally charged. So, counter heights in a kitchen are set at a certain height, and they're set relative to men's heights more than women, so that when I roll out dough on the counter, it's less comfortable for my back than my husband.
Mm.
There's lots of moments where full neutrality isn't possible. A female doctor using instruments that are sized for male hands will find that she has to hold them differently than they were designed because they don't accommodate her.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where I think admitting that men and women are different makes it easier to treat both men and women justly. Otherwise, you wind up pretending those differences don't exist, and that hurts the person whose differences aren't accommodated in the first place.
Yeah. And that's, I love the chapter, your chapter titles actually are all very clever, but chapter 1 is the world is the wrong shape for women. And you go through some of those examples to things that are, inconvenient, to some things that are based on the male standard, even though it's not a male exclusive environment or, particular, and that it can actually be extremely dangerous and deadly for women. So there's a lot of good information there that I think maybe people hadn't thought of before. But this is also so striking too, because this really ends up affecting so many members of the family. Babies can't survive a culture that despises dependence. A baby who can't be easily accommodated is expected to be aborted. We cannot live a full, flourishing life when our basic biology is treated as a design flaw. So we have a couple minutes before the break, but Leah, this idea that we are interchangeable has really led to a place where women are expected to reject the natural function that their bodies have in bearing children.
That's right. I think we see that as somehow taking away from what it means to be a woman because it interrupts the rest of life. There's this attempt to kind of cordon it off. There's real life, which is the things you take on deliberately, your work, your hobbies, your friendships, and then there's childbearing, which because it comes unbidden, even when you want it, you can't control it.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of runs counter to the idea that everything important in life is chosen, and it's treated as though it's an interruption and possibly an unjust interruption of a human life, as opposed to the way each of us comes into the world, something worthy of honor and thinking about how our whole society should be ordered to make space for pregnancy.
Yeah, so good. As I've been reading this, I just realized that what you've written here, Leah, is really about acknowledging and accepting and, like you said, honoring who we were created to be as human beings. And you have some ideas, too, and suggestions for how our culture can do a better job of honoring God's design. But Leah, I want to go back and focus on something we kind of touched on a few minutes ago, because it really, I think, is helpful for this entire conversation, but including when we kind of zero in on the issue of, pro-lifers and abortion, to understand our terms. And so for people who advocate for the unborn, seeing their humanity is so obvious to us that it can be puzzling when the other side argues that abortion, restriction to abortion dehumanizes women. And so if we want to understand why they're saying that, then we really need to understand how they are defining what it means to be human. So can you let's circle back and focus on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think part of the struggle in how we define what it means to be human is we often define it according to our capacities rather than our nature. And when you have a construction of being human that depends on your capacities, can you speak for yourself? Can you get yourself around? Can you do various things for yourself? Then everyone's claim to be human is tenuous. A bad car accident, a lingering disease might be enough to push you out of the category of fully human if you lose your voice, your mobility, your cognitive facilities. And we see more and more that it's not only the unborn who are kind of only tenuously connected to the claim of being human. The unborn are grandfathered in, so to speak, based on whether their mother wants them or not.
Mm.
And now increasingly the elderly find that whether or not they're fully human, whether or not they could be viewed as legitimate targets of lethal violence, depends on how much they burden other people,
Yeah.
that the increased prevalence of euthanasia, medical aid in dying, means that at this point, 1 in 20 deaths in Canada comes at a doctor's hands because we view the elderly as not clearly, unambiguously human.
Wow. Yeah, and I'm glad you made that connection too, because I wanted to discuss that as well. What we're really seeing is, as you articulated, the lie about what it means to be a human or what it means to be a person is to be autonomous, and to that capacity versus nature, as you said. And so, yeah, that's something that struck me. I was reading recently, more about the issue of medical aid in dying in Canada, and how in so many cases, I believe this was an article in the Atlantic, that what it came down to, even the doctors being interviewed saying, were you okay with this? Somebody who wasn't even terminally ill, but it's all about autonomy. And it is, well, that was their choice. And, if they've lost autonomy, or that was their autonomous choice. And so that's seen as what it means to be human, as the thing that you strive for. But going back to, women, what's the flip side, though? Because if abortion is seen as the ticket, so to speak, back to autonomy and therefore back to personhood, what happens when a woman chooses to remain pregnant? How does this society see her then?
I think one of the things we see is that this is framed as, well, once it's your choice, then it's only on you. You could have chosen otherwise. So how could we owe something to you if this is fully voluntary, almost a hobby to have this baby? And you see this, unfortunately, even among people who are pro-life when it comes to talking about the baby, but don't sound as pro-life talking about the mother.
Yeah.
I work in public policy, and a lot of my work is, how do we support families who are on the edge, who might be on the cusp of making a decision about abortion? And I get pushback of, how is that baby anyone else's business? Shouldn't she have not had it if she's poor? And, the challenge is, however the baby came to be, the mom is in need now. So how do we respond?
Yeah.
But because she could choose otherwise, it sounds easier for people to say, well, she picked this. It's her fault.
Yeah. I hear that too, so often even in Christian circles, again, like just kind of the way that we have grown accustomed to thinking about other people and our capacity and our responsibility. But we talked about how, our current society tends to define humanity or personhood as having capacity to take care of themselves, having autonomy. But want to know how you, as a Christian, how would you define personhood? And it really goes back to how we were made and what we were made for, doesn't it?
Yes. And this is where I think for Christians in particular, the idea that we're not autonomous shouldn't be a surprise. It might be a surprise to other people, but it can't be a surprise for Christians, because however strong we are, secure we are, however much savings we have to cushion us against the turbulence of the world, we still know that we did not create ourselves, that we rely on God to conserve us in existence and to redeem us. So the idea that we could stand on our own is obviously false from a Christian perspective. It's not a surprise that we depend on God. It shouldn't be a surprise we depend on each other. From a secular point of view, I think it's easier to have the idea that we're very nearly our own authors, since you might start from a purely materialist point of view and not view any need for salvation. But for a Christian, I think there's no excuse in believing that.
Yeah. And even, looking at the calls that we are given to exist in local church community and to be the body of Christ, that all implies that we are very interconnected and not isolated. And yet I think that for many of us, it's easy to, without even realizing it, let society kind of define our understanding of those things. But something that I was wanting to get your take on too, you use the phrase other as a threat to self. So if we again view autonomy and freedom from others' needs as a right, then others' needs do become a threat. And so this section was specifically talking about mothers and their children, but it also kind of reminded me of some of the anti-marriage rhetoric that we have seen among many men on the far right, where you're kind of hearing, this message, or a lot of young men are, that don't commit, don't tie yourself down, because, basically you need to be able to have the freedom and autonomy, commitment free. Do you see that as a connection as well?
Yeah, I like the way people contrast the capstone versus cornerstone view of marriage, where the capstone is you get your whole life together, you figure out who you are, and then you add marriage on top once you've built a foundation, alone. And the cornerstone view, which is the one I hold to, is that marriage is something you can begin as soon as you find the right person. And in fact, it's easier to build together and have your marriage as the bedrock of everything you're doing together. But I think that view really only works when you believe, yes, marrying someone will limit my options. When I marry someone who works in a particular industry, then we can only live in the places where that industry flourishes. So yes, marriage is a narrowing in many ways, but it's a narrowing for the sake of being able to make a big yes to someone. And the idea of keeping every door open is also a narrowing because it precludes the option of making a big commitment.
And this is kind of fast forwarding a bit, but you do have a chapter on men specifically. So in a couple minutes before the break, we can maybe introduce this and then dive a little bit deeper when we come back. But it's really the opposite of what men need. That capstone or just no marriage, totally free, autonomous, so to speak, message that a lot of young people are hearing is actually not aligned with what causes us to flourish. And so you really focus on that in your chapter on men, how there is a deep need to be needed and have commitment. That's right. Because, the whole book is framed first through the lens of women, because as I said, I think women encounter first and more vividly how badly the ideal of autonomy fails us. But it hurts men too. Men later in life, or because of difficult circumstances, may find that they're in profound need, but often men will be stronger, more independent. But a culture that doesn't value dependence or views it as shameful won't have room for men's distinctive gifts, because then being helped is humiliating. And men wind up with this excess of strength and nowhere to discharge it, nowhere to offer it in love. Yeah, so insightful. So we're about to go to a break, and I just wanted to read this quote. This is something that you wrote, Leah, before we go to our break that I wanted to quote. This is from Justice Kennedy in the case Planned Parenthood versus Casey, and he wrote, "At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life." And I want to highlight that because, as you highlighted it, it really just encapsulates this lie that we've been discussing over the last several minutes of the idea that we have a right to freedom from other humans, and that what it means to be human and what it means to be a person is to be completely autonomous, even define our own concept of existence.
Hey there, Megan Kitchen here, creator of the Highlights podcast. Sorry to interrupt, but I would like to ask a small favor if I could. If you appreciate anything about today's episode or it enhances your own point of view, would you please let us know? You can do it easily by sending an email to podcastcomments@pointofview.net. When you email us your feedback, it helps me to create more episodes based on topics that help you and your friends discern a biblical perspective on the world. So, penny for your thoughts? Again, that email is podcastcomments@pointofview.net. Now, back to the episode. We're back with Leah Sargeant talking about her book, The Dignity of Dependence. So a few minutes ago, we discussed how in our society today, really the functioning definition of what it means to be a human person is autonomy, and that we have a supposed right to freedom from others' needs. And that can cause so many issues as we have been discussing, embarrassment about asking for help, and the expectation that we cut ourselves off from people who depend on us. And so for women, this is very clearly seen with regard to things like pregnancy and the decision whether or not to have an abortion. Because, Leah, as you said, if we see pregnancy and having a dependent as a threat to our own personhood, then abortion is seen as the ticket back to society, so to speak. And then when a woman chooses to go ahead and have her baby,
women or society says, well, that's your fault. So now we're not going to help you because you made that choice, as if it was a choice that we could so easily make, whether or not to have people naturally depend on us. And so this is, there's something similar for men. And we're talking about how you do address men's issues in your book as well. But because of our differences, men can more easily separate themselves. But does that create an expectation that they will?
Yes, I think that's one of the really hard parts. Men are also made both to receive care and to give it. But there is an assumption that, when you have a baby, when your parent is going into hospice, that men are not necessarily going to be touched by that. In pregnancy, it's obvious the moment you physically connect to this.
Okay, Leah, we're going to have to try to reconnect with you because unfortunately there's a little trouble with your line. But one of the things that Leah highlighted that I'll just talk about for a minute while we're trying to reconnect is that she got some comments while she was writing this chapter titled Men into the Breach, where young men reached out and talked about how when they weren't connected to a family, then there was really something missing. Because it's one thing to serve in a local community or a local church or even with friends, and many people obviously have a rich life doing those things. But with women, a lot of times we are more naturally and kind of automatically tethered to somebody. There is a built-in need. And as humans, we do have a need to be needed. And so I just thought that message from the quote that she includes from a young man was so insightful because there is a real desire to be needed. And yet, as I was asking Leah and what we were about to talk about, is that because of society prioritizing autonomy above everything else, and men not being as obviously connected to their family, to their dependents, then they are expected to actually cut themselves off. And it's seen as a problem when they want to prioritize family. So anyways, Leah, I think you're back with us, but go ahead and jump back in.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you.
Excellent. Well, as always, I'm at the mercy of circumstances outside my control, just like everyone else.
Just like we all are.
More boring ones. Yep. I think one of the challenges for men in particular is that we're made to care for each other. We're made to have other people depend on us and vice versa. But because women have this intense biological claim that forces us to be open to other people's needs, for men, it takes much more of an active choice to step into it. And because, again, it becomes a choice, it can be undervalued or men can be pressured not to say yes to the needs of others.
Yeah. And that is just such the opposite message that we need. And ironically, too, is what men need to choose to step up and to be there. And I think maybe you talk about this a little bit, too, in your book. In other times and other seasons, and maybe even in other cultures, that need to step up and step in is more obvious when the stakes are very high, for instance, in war. But when the day-to-day, it can be just as fulfilling and still fulfilling that need to be needed that men have, but it's not as obvious. It's a little bit more mundane than maybe being called up to go and fight to protect your family, isn't it?
That's right. I think we should remember that we're very lucky to live in a time of almost unprecedented safety and prosperity.
Yeah.
So that men relatively rarely expect they have to put their body in between their family and physical danger or intense physical need. And that's a blessing. But it means that women retain the way that we put our bodies directly at the service of the people we love through pregnancy. And that for men, it's finding new channels for that bodily love.
Yeah, so good. So many insights and just things that, we operate according to these realities, but we deny them or just maybe kind of go oblivious. And it is so powerful when we acknowledge this, and really it can allow us to live with more intention. But I do want to go back to something that you talk about in chapter 4 of your book titled The Incredible Shrinking Woman. And again, something that we referenced is that really the waves of feminism that I think most of us think of when we hear the word feminism are often a rejection of our differences and kind of those interchangeable widgets, as you say in the book, of being able to just kind of plug in and operate in a machine without any difference. But there is a very dark side, and I mean, that in itself is wrong, but there's an even darker side too that really can affect young girls in particular. And so you make a connection between the struggle with anorexia that plagues many young women when they start becoming a young woman, going through puberty, but then also trans identification. And that's something that a lot of people probably haven't connected. So could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think anorexia is a good example of a place where people intended to support girls and wound up inadvertently harming them, and there are parallels for our situation today. When I was in middle school, we'd get talks on anorexia, that were all framed through, some girls who are really high achieving sometimes decide to stop eating. And it makes them feel good for a while because they have this control they lack elsewhere. And the adults were trying to help. Felt like sometimes we're in a pro-anorexia talk. Many girls like you do this. It feels good for them initially. Don't do it, though. It's an attempt at consciousness raising or awareness that can backfire. Anorexia is socially contagious. We know this. America has, unfortunately, helped spread it to other countries by trying to raise awareness. And similarly, this intense discomfort for one's body that many people experience during puberty and just in response to a culture that can victimize girls for their bodies can be steered inadvertently by adults towards the rejection of being a woman at all, rather than the rejection of a body through anorexia, the rejection of womanhood through trans identification. And I don't think these adults are malicious any more than the ones giving the anorexia talk were. There's a thought of, do girls need to hear about this? Will it help to tell them that it can be a mistake when it causes people to characterize their normal bumpy feelings about puberty as something that can best be solved by fitting into the symptom pool.
Yeah, and that is so important for us to realize. And it kind of recalls your first chapter, The World is the Wrong Shape for Women. And this is something, too, that I thought was so sad. You cite Dr. Sophia Yen, who basically is wanting to market a pill that will completely suppress women's cycles so that they can function the same way that men's can. And what I thought was so sad was this quote you include from her that she wants women to be competitive against people who don't have uteruses. And the reason that is sad is because, as you so well lay out, Leah, is that our society has really made the male norm the norm, and not just the male norm, but the healthy male norm. So anybody who is not male, anybody whose bodies naturally, according to God's design, function differently, anybody who is disabled, anybody who is young or old or sick and has more needs, they are not accommodated well because we idolize that autonomy. And so there are so many implications of this in our society, including making young girls feel very insecure and uncomfortable and unwelcome from the very start. And so this is, I think, you see some of those very dark implications in women really just wanting to shrink away. And young women wanting to do that too. If you've missed any part of the interview or you'd like to check out Leah's writings and get the book for yourself, then you can do that at pointofview.net. Also, let me remind you, we had a great conversation with Dr. Paul Cannings on examples of women in leadership in the Bible, his book, Leaders and Heels. That was also a great conversation. So if you missed it, you can go back to pointofview.net and you can listen on the podcast. But Leah, let's talk about, We've discussed the issue here. We've discussed that, women are often not valued and accepted as women, as the way that, our bodies work and that we were created to function in society. And really at the core of that is, as you say, an idolization of autonomy. And that harms not only women, but anybody and everybody. So practically, though, what are some ways that we can address this? I think you discuss some of these ways in your chapter, Illegal to Care, and how so many of our policies treat ordinary life events, as you write, like childbearing and aging as a surprise. Like you mentioned at the beginning of our conversation, like, oops, they got caught in needing something. And we act like that is an anomaly rather than just the normal flow of life. So what are some ways that we can really do a better job as a society of accommodating those different seasons of life?
I think one big part of it is, how can these needs be visible in your community? Because that's where things often, get stuck right from the start. For us to be able to answer the needs of our neighbors, we need to know what the needs of our neighbors are. And that's very challenging if your needs stay private. So one thing I tell readers to do is, in the next week, starting now from when you're listening, ask someone for help. Ask them for help with something you could do yourself. So it's clearer you're asking because you think it's okay to ask for help, not just because you're an extremist. And it's many of those moments of trust, of asking someone to pick up your kids, asking for someone to bring you a meal when you're sick, that build up the relationships of love that allow us to make asks in big moments.
I think that is so good and so difficult because I know that even I struggle with, asking for help. And like you said, even if you technically could do it, but again, going back to even a Christian perspective, we're supposed to function in community and together and lean on one another as the body of Christ. And something else that I thought was really profound and important, you write that we need to have an openness to the reality of pain. So just like our culture kind of pretends like we all can define our own existence, even though we really can't flourish when we're not living inside of reality, we tend to think that we can just kind of erase pain or ignore it or hide it away. But how does our relationship with pain and openness to that create actually a healthier society?
I think it leaves us freer to help each other, because it doesn't feel like you're letting someone down or revealing a secret when it turns out normal part of being a person. I think often we go the most wrong when we're kind of so frightened of looking needy or acknowledging need that we're only able to interact with each other by apologizing for it or hiding it or making it smaller than it is. You see this even around grief, that people struggle with this sense of, well, how can I help someone who's mourning? Maybe it's by making grief small rather than admitting this is large and difficult. I've run into this myself in the process of having miscarriages, where people who genuinely meant to help me would kind of frame their help through this idea of, well, I'm sure it won't happen again, or the next baby will be fine. That's not a promise they could make me. But it came out of being unsure how to sit with loss.
Yeah, and it does come from a place of good intention. But you're right, we tend to diminish the pain that somebody is often going through because we don't know how to sit with it and how to actually encourage somebody in it. That's so good. But another thing too that I think is helpful, especially for women, and I've got young kids, and so there's a lot of things to juggle, and so this, I really related with this. Sometimes when we are maybe even subconsciously buying into that false definition of personhood or of self, so many seasons of life can feel like a conflict. Like, this is keeping me from my true self. This pregnancy, I can't move as fast as I once moved. Or even this season of parenthood, I'm having to give up something that's really important to me. But I want to be there for my kids. I feel conflicted. So how can we kind of do a better job at defining even ourselves and what the path of life is supposed to look like, so that some of those things don't feel like they're wrong?
Well, there's a quote I come back to a lot from Father Richard Newhouse, where he's talking about the question of abortion. He says people say sometimes that the baby in the womb doesn't look like a person, and his response is, that is what a person looks like at this age. It's what you and I looked like. It's what Ephraim looked like at this age. And I try and come back to that for myself in moments of need or disruption, when I have the temptation to say, as I did for a moment 2 years ago when I both was pregnant, nauseated, and then had a staph infection that sent me to the ER. And I heard myself say, I barely existed this November. And then I paused, listening to myself, and went like, of course that's not true. I existed for all of November. This is what existing looked like for me. So kind of always coming back to that moment of this is what it looks like to be a human person who is sick, who is pregnant, who is small, who is injured. This is still a human life because I, a human, am having it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And that life is valuable inherently, and doesn't lose its value just because it is in a different state or season than we have falsely considered the norm in society. Leah, this has been a conversation that I've been looking forward to, and I've been looking forward to your book. And I just, again, thank you for sharing your time with us on Point of View. But if you had final words or hopes that people take away from your book here, what would those be?
I think it's that we can live our fullest, most just life when we live our life in connection to the truth. And we live in a society right now that doesn't tell the truth about the human person. Not in the womb, not at the end of life, and not for women throughout their lives. The only way towards justice is by telling the truth.
Yeah, that is so good. Well, Leah, again, thank you so much for being on Point of View today. If you want to follow Leah's work, if you want to get a copy of the book and follow her blog, Other Feminisms, you can find all of those links at pointofview.net. But before I let you go, I just wanted to highlight one more quote from Leah's book, Dignity of Dependence. And she ended it so well, too. And that is something that we care about so much at Point of View, which is truth. She says, when the world starts with a false image of the human person, it is difficult to become re-rooted in truth. Unlearning the world's contempt for weakness isn't a simple intellectual shift. It takes sustained, lived counter-catechesis. So that means we are going to have to be intentional about re-rooting ourselves in truth. And this has so many implications for so many issues that I know you care about, whether that is the issue of abortion and advocating for the unborn, the issue of euthanasia for the elderly or the sick, the issue of just caring better for different members of our society in different seasons of life. And so we can articulate that from a biblical perspective of how all human life has value in those different seasons. And I think that's such a beautiful call and beautiful encouragement that Leah gave us. Thank you so much for listening to Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McArtor. Thanks so much for listening to today's Point of View Highlights. I'm Liberty McArtor, host of the Know Why podcast, a weekly podcast for young adults who want to know why they believe what they believe. If you have young adults in your life who would like more meaningful conversations like this, send them over to knowwhypodcast.com. And we'll see you next time on Point of View Highlights.